This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate. This episode is brought to you by the Israel Democracy Institute, an independent center of research and action dedicated to strengthening the foundations of Israeli democracy. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guests today are Professors Amichai Cohen and Yuval Shany from the Israel Democracy Institute. Amichai Cohen is an expert in international humanitarian and criminal law and national security law in Israel. He is the director of the Center for Security and Democracy, as well as a researcher on national security and democracy. He co-authored the book entitled Israel's National Security Law, Political Dynamics and Historical Development, and has contributed to several UN reports. Professor Shany is the current Vice President of Research at the Center for Democratic Values and Institutions and the Center for Security and Democracy. In addition, he is a member of the UN Human Rights Committee and an expert in international criminal and human rights law and law in war. Both Professor Cohen and Professor Shany have published extensively on the role of the IDF in Israel society, as well as the influence of international law on the IDF. Amichai Cohen, Yuval Shany, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. Hello.
Thank you very much.
So let's start with you, Professor Cohen. Is there any other democracy in the world where the army plays such a major role in public life as Israel?
The short answer is no, and for several reasons. First of all, mandatory military service is something that, in practical terms, only Israel still has. There are other countries where it's mostly nominal, like Switzerland. You can easily get out of it. But currently, only Israel has full military service, and the length of the service in Israel is significant. So many Israelis go through. Maybe later we'll talk about it. How many? It's not that every Israeli go through it, but a lot of Israelis go through the military service. Second of all, Israel is still one of the democracies in which armed conflict is part of life in Israel. So Israel has conflicts, and the conflicts are very close to Israel. So the United States is also involved in conflicts, but these are far away. The idea that a conflict is very close to home is a significant part of Israeli life. So from both these angles, the army, the armed services, security organizations are very much part of Israel still.
I think to understand something that you began to raise here about the fact that not everybody does service, I want to talk about those changes, but to understand that, can you tell us something more about the role that the IDF has played historically in Israel in terms of Israeli society and what it means now? And then we'll talk about who serves and how many and why.
Because the thing is, it's not just a necessary evil. Every nation at war needs an army and needs people to serve in it. But in Israel, it's traditionally been more than that.
It's the army and more.
Historically, as Ben-Gurion conceived the IDF, the army was a melting pot. The idea that people come from the diaspora and they need something to unite them, and military service was this thing that united people. And of course, you could see that not only the army took in a lot of people from different backgrounds, but it also was involved in many, many national challenges and things that other institutions in Israel could not do. The IDF also opened the doors for a lot of classes in Israel that otherwise were not part, the internal circle of society, so from the periphery. So people who came from, North African countries, they found the army to be the great equalizer, right, where everybody could advance and everybody could serve. It was a very important part of the beginnings of the Israeli society. There was a problem in it, even when it was, because the idea was that there is a hegemon. It's usually a male, Ashkenazi, secular person, and this is the ideal model. And then everybody has to become this. The melting pot is intended to make everyone into this ideal model. So everybody loses its own identity. But anyway, it worked
But in some ways, that's a problem with all of Israeli society. There was supposed to be this kind of ideal Israeli in the early years, and everybody was supposed to melt into it, and that didn't work so much either.
Yeah, but I think I want to follow up on Amichai's point about the military being a one important functioning part of Israeli government. So in a way, the combination of security challenge which made the military a very key player, but also the military being a functioning apparatus, because it's not, it's much more disciplined than what you see in general Israeli society. It has a strong ethos of meritocracy. So as Amichai noted, the major challenges, national challenges, be it to settle the desert, from undertaking the disengagement from Gaza, the one entity who could undertake a major project of that nature was the military. So in a way, all of these problems that we are seeing about the melting pot and about hegemony, since the army is a central institution, we are confronting this in the army in a much more dramatic fashion than, for instance, the education system or the health system, which has all of this, but they don't play the same kind of role in Israeli society. They're not the training grounds for Israel's elite, for Israel's leadership.
Okay, so the army is a very effective and competent government agency, if you will. But then going back to this notion of its place in democracy, I'd like to ask you, Yuval, what are really the constitutional and legal provisions that would prevent it from becoming a Frankenstein monster? How do we know that tomorrow morning there won't be a military coup just because someone wanted to?
Well, this was something that was very important for Ben-Gurion, as you may recall, and this was one of the most dramatic decisions that were undertaken in the midst of the 48 war, in which Ben-Gurion not only articulated the principle that there will be one uniform set of chain of command and there will be no militias, but he actually also put his money where his mouth is, literally, by actually ordering basically the stamping out of the Etzel, the Irgun, and of course dismantling the Palmachs. So there was the notion that there will be one solidified force and it will be subject to control by the Israeli government. And Israeli constitutional law, which Amichai has written on extensively, has followed this model and authorizes the government actually to control over the military. And by and large, this principle that the military is a professional agency, but it is subject to political control by elected officials, hence the government, this has never been seriously challenged. We have had in recent years some interesting iterations concerning the leaked plan to attack Iran, where there has been some pushback from the military. But this has been quite exceptional, and even that wasn't probably as dramatic as it was made out in the press.
Just to add 2 points. First of all is that, as Yuval said, there has never been really a doubt in Israel that the army is a subject to the control of the civil government. The problem is whether the civil government wants to make decisions. So this is a major question. Maybe we'll speak about it later. But let's just fast forward on and pick up on an earlier point. The question of the role of the army becomes much more problematic where you have a society that does not recognize a hegemon anymore. So we used to have a society where there is a hegemon, as I said before, and then the army follows, and then the army follows. But now the society, as the President Rivlin said, we have a society of tribes. So you don't have a hegemon anymore. So why should there be a hegemon in the army? And we can see it. That, for example, national religious soldiers are saying, this is our army, right? We want to advance. We want to become an important part of the army. And you have this clash between liberal values, for example, service of women in the army, and then the national religious soldiers. You have ultra-Orthodox soldiers coming into the army and asking for specific possibilities of service within the army. So you have the external clashes within the Israeli society entering the IDF, and it's part of the idea of a people's army. The people's army means that the clashes within the society enter into the army. It's not something that's separate from the society.
Right, but at the same time, you've also documented that in some ways, it's no longer quite the people's army it once was, and that there are declining rates of participation in Israeli society. Do we have numbers on this? I mean, you've given some numbers in the present about how many people participate relative to those who are eligible for the draft. But also, do we know relative to previous years, is there a significant decline? What is the rise in percentage of national religious?
Right. So let's give the basic number. The basic number right now is that about 50% of cohorts of young people who come to the age of 18 enlist. But this includes women and Arabs and ultra-Orthodox, so people who are not even called up for service. Somewhere in the vicinity of 65% of people eligible for army service enlist. There is a change here, and the change is mostly a demographic issue. If you look at the numbers, the question of how many people enlist is very much connected to the question of the percentage of ultra-Orthodox young people. So as the number of ultra-Orthodox young people rise, there is a decline in the percentage of service. You don't see so much the question of people evading service. It's low percentages.
And
it's
a constant. It hasn't risen over the years.
It's not significant. It's mostly within the army, where do people serve? So more people from certain backgrounds want to serve in more high-tech units, for example. Less people want to go into combat service, but it's not the question of the service itself. Is not mostly the groups that went into army service earlier go into the army service. Where there is a significant change is in the percentage of national religious soldiers within officers' courses and officers' placement. So there is a significant rise and change of elites, of military elites, you could say there.
Just two issues in this regard. We are seeing, of course, a gradual rise in the number of ultra-Orthodox soldiers, not a dramatic rise, but a constant rise. And within the national religious group, we are seeing a rise in the number of women who are enlisting, and this is causing within the national religious group, this is causing some friction. Where we are seeing a very sharp drop actually is with reserve service, where the number of people who are doing reserve has dramatically declined. But this is also has to do with the army's move towards, we will talk about this maybe later, about a more professional track and smaller reliance than before on individuals called up for reserve.
So it's not so much that they don't want to enlist in reserves, it's just that the army doesn't really need or want them.
Well, I think it's a combination of both. I think people are, generally speaking, less anxious to go to reserve. They live very hectic life, and for the economy, it's not a good idea to pull out people for 1 month from doing whatever they're doing. It also costs a lot of money for the military to make up for these salaries, but it's also, so it's a push and pull.
Yeah.
So
there is a dramatic decline in the number of reserve days that the army calls up people to, something in the vicinity of 70% or something less than it used to be at the height of the...
Right. But maybe because the army is adapting itself to a different reality. But I want to ask you, what really are the knock-on effects on Israeli societies because of these changes? Or is it just the army reflecting demographic changes within the broader Israeli society? Is it like a two-way street, or is the army just being a mirror here?
So there are people, one of them, Professor Yagi Levi, who think that the changes within military elite mean that the army will adopt somewhat independent, perhaps, a view of Israeli politics, and the fact that national religious people now comprise a larger percentage of the army, especially, as I said, of the officer corps, is important in the term that it will limit the ability of the government to take different policies.
Can you specify those policies for our listeners?
So, for example, if you want to withdraw from the territories, so whether the army will participate. I must say, personally, I don't agree with this. The army, we have one test case, and it's the disengagement. There were almost no cases of soldiers disobeying orders. Perhaps there were gray disobedience cases where soldiers asked the commanders not to participate, But this was anyway at the periphery.
But hasn't a lot of this change in the higher rates of National Religious in the officers' corps happened since the disengagement, precisely as a response to the disengagement from the National Religious community?
Perhaps so, but we don't see any cases where you would say specifically National Religious soldiers are, say, more involved in violations of international humanitarian law. We don't have any facts on this. And I don't think it's the correct. There is a different problem here. And it's that the army now has to deal, because of technological advances, every soldier, you cannot detach the soldier from his background. And you have social networks. And every soldier is part not only of his unit, but also of his social network. And the effects of disagreement within Israeli society come into the army in a much greater way. You cannot say, okay, the unit is now detached from some kind of an Israeli disagreement. Everything immediately gets into the unit, every disagreement, every political disagreement. So the question is whether in a case of serious political disagreement in Israel, will the army be able to cope with this disagreement within units? So will the army be able to keep the units coherent and unified under external pressure of disagreement? This is a serious question.
And you're saying that that's partly because of technology, that there's this greater impact? People are constantly closer to their normal sources of, news, media, influence, environment?
Social networks have a lot of impacts. One of them is that our disagreements become greater. It's very easy to disagree in Facebook. Everybody becomes extreme. Now add to that the fact that soldiers are connected to these social networks. And what you have is an effect on soldiers of take for example, the Elor Azaria case. So one theory, and I think there is some basis to this theory, is that this person had his views and is part of a group that had certain views, and this had some impact on the way he behaved during an actual operation.
Yeah, we should say that Elor Azaria was an IDF soldier who was caught in Hebron, I think, executing wounded Palestinian stabber that had tried to attack his unit a fair few minutes before. So he wasn't under any sort of danger, but he still responded by live fire, and he was condemned by many, including the army itself that had jailed him, but also put on a pedestal, as you say, by many others.
Including, I'm sorry to say, several politicians.
And the Prime Minister.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point. I mean, there was one point in one of your articles where you say that there's, in this relationship or interaction between the political levels and the army, that there has been no danger of the army ever trying to take a political position, and that actually, I think you wrote at some point, the political levels sometimes consider whether the army might be a little more activist, which what we see here is that there was a complete split. The army criticized his behavior, the politicians supported it, and the public completely went with the politicians.
Right. I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we are confronting, in a way that you would expect the military to follow guidance from politicians, but you would also expect politicians to guide the military in ways which are consistent with basic values of society and consistent with the law. And here, around situations such as the Azaria case, where you have very senior politicians, including the current Minister of Defense, taking very extreme positions, which an Israeli court actually determined that they are unlawful, that Elor Azaria had conducted himself unlawfully.
Israeli military court.
Israeli military court, yes.
Which kind of perpetuates the split.
Of course. So in a way, you have soldiers. So I agree with Amichai, we are not so much concerned about the leadership, the higher level, because the officers, they have a backbone, they've been trained, they've been socialized, they've been vetted. The likelihood that an officer would go wrong is very insignificant. But the soldier on the ground who is confronted by conflicting messages, and some coming from the military ranks, but some coming from other sources of authority, such as the rabbis or the politicians or the public media, and through social media, he's no longer insulated. So there are actually these messaging. The messaging is coming across simultaneously simultaneously, that puts soldiers in a somewhat more difficult and more challenging positions, and also in a way puts commanders in a more delicate position because their authority in a way is being undermined by the environment that in a way was supposed to support them and to provide them with political cover for what they're doing. So this is actually a very delicate and difficult position in which the military is taking more liberal, more rule of law, more constitutional position. So we hate to give the Turkey analogy, which of course is a very sad analogy, but for many years we looked at the Turkish military as the guardian of the constitution, as somewhat of an anomaly, but we fear that we are moving a little bit in that direction here as well.
So let me ask you about a contradiction in Israeli life. Every single year, the Israel Democracy Institute publishes the Democracy Index, in which they test the levels of public trust in institutions in Israel. And every year, for as long as I can remember as a public opinion researcher, the most trusted institute in Israeli life is
the Army.
The IDF, of course. So why is it that the IDF has the highest level of public trust, but the moment there is a clash of values, as there was in the Elor Azaria case, and in many cases, as you point out, where the army would prefer more restraint or more protection of even certain liberal values, let's say military restraint, the public seems to immediately dismiss the army in favor of the more extreme version of the politicians. How can we explain this contradiction?
So several points here. So first of all, I think it's easy to explain why the army has the highest level of confidence, simply because a lot of people served in the army. Not a lot of people were politicians. You look outside at the politicians, they're all corrupt, etc., etc. But a lot of people, most people or many of the people, either themselves or one of their family was in the army. And so still, and people feel attached to the army and the wars, the memorial services, etc. Everything is there to support confidence in the army. There are two problems here. One is that if you break down the question of confidence in the army, you find that there is great confidence in the operational ability of the army still, although there were some cases in which the army was not so successful operationally, but still there is confidence. But when you start looking at the question of the budgetary behavior of the army, whether the army wastes money, whether the salaries are too high, the pension or arrangement of the army, then you start seeing some questions and doubts. You can see it becomes lower percent of confidence whether the army is a very efficient body or not. So once again, it might be because everybody served in the army and everybody knows it's not the most efficient institution. But there is another point here, I think. Take an analogy with the Supreme Court. Okay, so the Supreme Court used to enjoy very high levels of confidence close to the army. But once politicians started attacking the Supreme Court for political reasons, they had political gains from attacking the Supreme Court, then the level of confidence in the Supreme Court declined. So here's the question. Does the confidence in the army result from the fact that politicians haven't attacked it yet? But if there is, as Yuval said, some difference between the views of the politicians and the army, and then politicians would find some political gain in attacking the army in the future, might we see a decline in confidence in the army? What I'm saying is that confidence, it's not a constant thing. It's a thing that politicians and people who have an interest in it can manipulate public opinion, right, by attacking. So this is the major danger here. And this, of course, is the danger of the Turkey situation. Once the politicians find that the army is too great an obstacle for them to achieve their goals, then they would simply take the power away.
Okay, so it is a challenge.
If I can jump in, it's also wrong to identify the level of trust assigned to the army across the different groups. I mean, there are some groups whose level of trust in the military is quite limited. So the ultra-Orthodox, they relatively have low numbers. I mean, the national religious group has seen its numbers decline.
Why is that when they're such a prominent part in the office?
Partly because there's an ongoing process of clash between the military authorities and religious authorities on questions such as military service for women or the attempt to marginalize rabbis, sources of authority. And when you have your rabbi telling your prominent rabbis in that group telling their students not to go to the military if the military would not revoke its mixed service agenda. This, like Amichai said, this would erode the level of confidence. And of course, we didn't start speaking about the Israeli Arabs.
We will. We will.
Okay.
Although I should say, surprisingly, their level of confidence in the Israeli military hovers around 50%. So it's still one of the most trusted institutions in Israel, even for Israeli Arabs.
I think it's because you have to...
And that's partly because I think there is a sense, and this is the real reason, the army is out there serving our interest. I don't think anyone can seriously say that the army is not on the battlefield protecting our interest. I think with regard to other institutions of governance, I think more and more people are hard-pressed to say that politicians are out there fighting to serve our interests, or increasingly people are saying, are the courts there to serve our interests? Is the police there? With the military, we still have this basic, very visceral identification of someone fighting an external enemy on our behalf. So it's bound to produce high level of trust.
So I think that the question of confidence here is problematic because we should split it into two elements. One is the trust in the army doing its original job, which is to protect Israel's security. And I think, as you said, Yuval, nobody denies that it has a role and it does its job. The other one, its role as a melting pot, that is its historical role. And the question is whether with the demographic changes that Israel has undergone and is still undergoing, there's still a role for that in Israel today. And by mentioning the Arabs, I mean, you mentioned President Rivlin's famous speech about the 4 tribes. There's one tribe that is completely excluded from the military and its melting pot qualities, which is the Arabs. So maybe in order to think about the cohesion of Israeli society, maybe it's the crisis that the IDF is undergoing now when it's still small scale. Maybe it's time to, reverse a bit and look for another outlet as our potential melting pot.
So I think your question, maybe this was the meaning of your question. So whether we should consider now a professional army. So is there room for a people's army where actually only 50% of the people enlist? So is this still a people's army? And if not, and considering the issues we just talked about, is there still justification for taking only parts of society and saying to young people, well, listen, you have to dedicate 3 years of your lives to a service? What's the justification if it's only 50% of society, and is it still needed? It has to do with an operational issue. I think there is a major disagreement here regarding whether the army still needs everybody to come in and whether there is an actual possibility of having professional service in Israel. There are claims that it's impossible, not enough people will come, especially not enough good people will come. There is a serious disagreement here. But just as a starting point, for the discussion, so let's assume for a second it's still required, okay, that we still need the numbers, we still need the people, at least everybody should enlist, perhaps not everybody should serve at the same length, but let's assume this is the starting point. How do we keep a people's army when only 50% of society? So how do we tell young people come into service? And what do we do with the groups that don't enlist? There are several alternatives on the table. One of them, for example, is having a national or a civil service, right? This has not been a very successful experiment in Israel regarding men.
Has it been tried in earnest?
I think a fair level of success with religious women, especially national religious women.
But not so much with Arabs.
No, it has not succeeded with Arabs nor with ultra-Orthodox men. This has not been very successful. So is there a possibility to reform in some way, to give it some substance that would give it some meaning? It's not working very well, but maybe it's a better possibility. Another thing, I think this is what the army is doing with it, is saying, okay, we're enlisting a lot of people, but we'll shorten the service for many of them and we'll try to convince people to make it a career. So the people we want, will convince them that it's a good career. So, and this way, we will somehow level the playing field, because it'll be, you have to mandatory service, but a shorter service. So we can see the general service is becoming shorter now for men. It has already been shortened a little bit. It will be shortened more in the near future. And I think in the medium future, it will be shortened even more, because the justification for taking only from 50% of society 3 years is an eroding factor in the question of confidence.
But I think that I want to try to sharpen Gilad's question, because we have a symbiotic mind, so I know what he was trying to say, which is that maybe the army never really was the best melting pot for Israel, or maybe it was in the beginning, but it no longer is. For example, we already talked about the fact that Arabs do not serve. They are not included in the creation of a shared civic identity through the army, but neither are women, really. I mean, women get drafted, but they get drafted into very different positions, and the focus on the, male hero, the heroic figure of the army and the fighter is always going to buy a certain social currency for men that women will not enjoy. And class. I mean, you mentioned class divisions about the army as an equalizer, for example, for Mizrahim who come from North Africa and the Middle East. But I think that we all know there's an enduring reality where certain classes, often among the Mizrahim, go into what are considered to be the lower levels of service, such as border police. And, the privileged, highly educated, well-off people from Ashkenazi families going into the high-tech surveillance units that get them into these wonderful careers afterwards and perpetuate social stratification in Israel. Can this institution be reformed, or do we need a different social institution to create a shared civic identity that helps equalize Israeli society?
Fully agree with you. I think the idea of the melting pot, I think it had its run. But I don't think we are thinking anymore in these terms, not in terms of a melting pot. I think the melting pot idea was useful when one was dealing with an immigrant society, which was trying to rebuild a nation. Of course, even then it had huge problems, but there was some objective reason behind this. I think these days are gone. I think we are not thinking around these terms anymore, and it's good that we are not thinking in these terms anymore, and it's also not a good fit for the military because of many of the reasons you've mentioned. I don't think the army is particularly well situated. Having said that, I would want to say that with regard to women, I think the military has undertaken significant efforts to integrate women in all ranks and in all profession tracks. And I think that this, for instance, the involvement of women in the Air Force, this has had a knock-on effect on Israeli societies. So I wouldn't cast the blame on the military in that specific regard. What would be an alternative, however, this is a tricky question because our educational system is split
completely segregated
into tracks. Our higher education system is, of course...
Sorry, did you say 2 tracks?
No, into multiple tracks.
For listeners who don't know, secular, religious, ultra-Orthodox, and
Arab, etc. So we are in a way stuck without an institution that could... and we no longer have, in terms of, of media, having the central, campfire around which we come together. So maybe we are doomed. Not to have a unifying ethos, and maybe that's fine. I mean, if we could find ways to work across different groups and focus on that aspect, maybe it's not a great idea at this point in time that everyone would look the same. So maybe we would embrace multiculturalism in the end.
So do you see the status of the army further being reduced in Israeli public opinion? Is it a trend? Is that what I'm asking?
If it does not change the way it operates, then there will be some erosion in confidence. The question is whether the army will be able to be flexible enough to change in ways which are now more reflective of the way the society operates.
The army is not very well known for its flexibility, is it?
I don't know. This is a good question. For example, in adopting technological changes, right? The army is at the forefront of Israeli society. I would also say that in terms of accepting women, for example, so the army was, in a sense, and I accept what Yuval was saying, the army was a leader for its time. Women in the army were able to get into places where women in society outside the army were not able. Once again, with the...
And LGBTs as well. So
yeah, exactly.
We have seen the army play.
After the movie Yossi and Jagger.
No, even before that.
Yeah.
And Mizrahim, as we said. And there is another important point, is that now the army, for many groups, and it's the question whether the army will be able to actually utilize it and adapt to the needs of society. The army serves, for example, for the ultra-Orthodox. We know it from researchers taken at the Israel Democracy Institute. For the ultra-Orthodox, the army serves as a preparation for the workforce in many respects. So ultra-Orthodox soldiers gain a profession when they go into army service. So there are ways in which the army could adapt.
We really have to end, but I feel like I should say that I think the question about gender is not just about how well women can be integrated inside the army, but the fact that in Israeli society, that's what has to be done for women to achieve the male level of credibility. In other words, it's the social perception that the army holds the highest currency rather than a shift of values that say women's roles have their own weight.
Yeah, not just for women.
This is Sparta, as the movie said.
I think there is a change here.
Welcome to Sparta.
I think there is a change here. The symbolic value of army service was indeed very important in the 80s and 90s. But now it's more about preparation for the workforce. So the question is whether women served in the high-tech units within the army, then they are able to get into high-tech, good, high-paying, high-tech jobs. It's more a question now. I think it's less a question of the symbolic value of service. It's more a question of what did you gain out of military service. And there is, of course, a problem there, different groups having more, but I don't think it's gender.
No,
it's
but
more along socioeconomic lines.
Right, and then it's slippery because even if, let's say, I agree with your point, let's just say, hypothetically, then you still are left with the problem that 20% of the population is not included at all in this framework. And we haven't solved that.
And we haven't solved that. And I
we
don't
haven't
think
solved
we will.
anything.
But for the things that we have solved, thank you very much for coming in today, Professor Yuval Shany and Professor Amichai Cohen of the Israel Democracy Institute.
Thank you.
Thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Julia Brahms and Itai Shelem, our producers. And a big thank you to the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute for their generous support. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review. Then write one. Check out our archives. We have over 450 interviews. If you like us, you can like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel, and follow both Gilad and me on Twitter. Join us next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.